The story of the Stage 3 tax cuts is still live and kicking. It's already spanned across 3 prime ministers, 3 treasurers, and 3 opposition leaders. No one will take credit for it, and it's hard to designate blame to a single ideologue or party. Let's take a quick recap of what you could only describe as Australian politics at its worst. This is how the Stage 3 tax cuts became legislation: the removal of the second highest tax bracket in Australia. Back in 2018, Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, Scott Morrison was Treasurer, and I was taking a Year 11 economics class in an asbestos-filled portable high school classroom, which was producing a higher level of economic reasoning than what we were about to be introduced to on budget night.
Tonight I announce a 7-year personal tax plan to make personal income tax lower, fairer and simpler. In 2024-25, we will simplify the personal tax system by abolishing the 37-cent tax bracket entirely.
This May budget was their last before the Liberal government would call an election, after a quick leadership switcheroo, of course. And all eyes were on the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, who stood up and opposed the tax cuts.
How on earth can it be fair, Mr Speaker, for a nurse on $40,000 to pay the same tax rate as a doctor on $200,000? For a cleaner to pay the same tax rate as a CEO? This is looking like another mates rates tax plan from the Liberal Party. And at a time of flat wages, growing inequality, and a greater sense of unfairness in this community, when too many job seekers are stuck in poverty, when children go to school hungry, when women fleeing family violence cannot find safe accommodation, people are worried that this plan is neither fair nor affordable. And we will not allow the Prime Minister to threaten to block tax cuts for 10 million Aussies unless the Parliament writes a cheque for high-income earners 7 years hence.
Then in 2019, we went to the polls with what everyone was expecting to be a Labor victory until this happened.
I want to say beyond this room to Australians who supported Labor, I know that you're all hurting, and I am too.
I have always believed in miracles.
Now, this is an important juncture. The Labor Party was shocked that Bill couldn't pull off the election win, and immediately went and blamed their taxation policies. Keep in mind that Stage 3 wasn't the only tax reform policy Labor were proposing. They were also looking at things like negative gearing, and the Liberal Party ran a really bad scare campaign on a supposed death tax that never existed. The tax cut legislation was set to be brought on in the first week of the new Parliament, and all eyes were on what new Labor opposition leader Anthony Albanese was going to do.
Congratulations to Scott Morrison on his election as Prime Minister. I say to him that I will hold his government to account. Strongly, forcefully. I am a values politician.
The coalition didn't have a majority in the Senate, so if Labor, the Greens and the crossbench blocked it, this would have been the end of Stage 3. But the Labor Party, instead of putting pressure on the crossbench not to cave, Labor's own MPs were out publicly releasing the pressure valve and stating Labor should back in the tax cuts in full. And so that's what they did in the House of Reps, leaving Greens Adam Bann and Independent MP Andrew Wilkie opposing it on their own, and the tax cuts survived. Then it came to the Senate, where the government didn't have a majority, and instead of refusing to vote for the legislation and pushing Jackie Lambie and Centre Alliance to block it too, as the Greens were doing, Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers folded.
We won't oppose the full package if it comes to the Senate unamended.
Instead vowing to review Stage 3 of the 7-year $158 billion plan at the next election.
All sides of politics review, depending upon economic circumstances, we will do that.
So this legislation was set to come into a minority Senate, legislation that Labor supposedly didn't agree with, and the Greens will have to fight it again on their own.
This intellectually vacant swill that have congealed themselves together into a government, you're just going to let them get on with it because it's too hard. It's too hard and you're too sad. Oh, you'd got the curtains cut for the windows. You were going to be this minister and that minister. It was all going to go as you'd planned and it didn't. And you're so sad. It's such a shame. And while you're having your little pity party, you're letting these folks get away with the largest bank robbery that's ever been perpetrated on the public purse. It is shameful. The best you could do today during question time was ask these guys whether they produce a letter. I mean, for God's sake, why don't you just give up and go home? You are choosing tonight, you lazy, greedy rump, to put your own interests and the interests of your corporate donors ahead of the interests of the Australian people.
The Labor Party then voted for the tax cuts in full again, and the tax cuts were legislated with the votes of Labor, Lambie and the Centre Alliance. Just quickly, the idea that the coalition had a mandate and therefore Labor had to vote for this is a very creative argument. Oppositions vote against legislation they don't agree with. That's kind of how the whole thing works. We didn't see the coalition change their mind and vote for Labor's climate targets after the 2022 election, did we?
The result of the division is ayes 56, noes 9. The matter is resolved in the affirmative.
And then we all went to the polls again, and Labor won, proposing no new substantial changes to taxation, which kind of defeats the purpose of changing governments. But anyway.
Now, I will lead a government worthy of the people of Australia. A government as courageous and hard-working and caring as the Australian people are themselves.
And now we have a policy that was only ever proposed as a last-ditch attempt by Scott Morrison to bribe rich people into voting for him back in 2019, legislated with bipartisan support even after a pandemic, a $1 trillion deficit, inflation rates over 7% and 10 consecutive interest rate rises, and the tax cuts survive.
If the economy gets worse between now and then, as this has, it takes a week to change the tax rates. If the economy can't handle a huge tax cut in 6 years, then people expect their politicians to say so, be upfront and be honest. And if the risk is too big to justify it, people will understand rolling it back or putting it on hold for the time being. The only way you can think that the worst bits of this tax bill are permanent is if you believe that nobody in this place can do the right thing and the responsible thing.